Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over the different tools and methods that you can use to sand your 3D prints. To start things off, I'm going to be showing you guys a lot of different tools that you can use for sanding your 3D prints. This is all pre-prime, so this is specifically sanding the physical 3D print itself. So right here, there's a value pack of 4 different types of sandpapers, Gator sandpapers. You have a 60, an 80, a 120, and a 220. And this will take you from your rough supports, as you can see on this Ant-Man helmet. I printed it face down, so the supports on it are very rough. If you hit it with a 60, and then an 80, 120, and 220, it comes out really smooth. This is kind of like the baseline for any start of sanding a 3D print. At least starting with a 80 or a 120 will help really knock down those layer lines. The more that you can knock down those layer lines at the beginning, the easier it'll be. You want to try to sand as much of the 3D print as you can before you put on your primer. So while you're able to make those lines disappear before you even have to lay on a coat primer, this is the best way to do it. After that, we have a 400 and 600 wet or dry sandpaper. You can combine that with the sanding block that I have here. It'll make it easier for sanding big surfaces, even these helmets. You just lock it into place on the 2 ends and it'll act as a grip for your sandpaper. The 400 and 600 grit sandpapers, wet or dry, is gonna start to really show the smoothness of your print. So now we have different types of files. You can use these on the eyes, on the bottom of the prints, and also in the finer details. As you can see, I use ones that I got from a Harbor Freight. You can also use these cheap nail files, and these act as the same sort of thing. It's just a sandpaper on a stick. These files help a lot when it comes to digging into the detailed lines, especially when you put primer and Bondo on. These will help to revive those details. So here we have a 400 grit sandpaper, and this is when you're going to start your wet sanding. So once you hit 400, you go to 800, 1000, and 1500. Once you hit that 1500, you're going to use soap and water, and this will help make the entire print glass smooth. I usually do this with every print, and it helps to minimize the amount of primer and Bondo that you have to apply to make the print smooth. If you didn't want to go with a wet option, you can also try the steel wool. Now this stuff is basically a sandpaper, sort of like a foam sandpaper, and it acts as a buffing solution for your 3D prints. You can use this on the primer or the print, and this will basically make the entire print smooth as well as like the wet sanding does. Also, some other tools we have is sanding sponges. These are great for when you're trying to get inside of a helmet or on the edges. This will help get into the details that you can't normally get. You can also use a flexible sandpaper. And then now onto the power tool. So there's different types of power tools. You have the orbital, the quarter sheet, and the precision palm sanders. This is a precision palm sander. So basically it just vibrates while the sanding is going on. And here is a type of orbital sander. It actually has 3 discs on it that rotate. It's almost like a electric shaver, and you can just go around the print and it'll morph to the shape of the model. Another thing that kind of seems odd but is actually very useful for sanding 3D prints is the soldering iron. So if you just have a cheap soldering iron, you can actually take it and glide it along the bottom of the print on your support areas to try to just smooth those out without having to sand them too roughly. It'll make them nice and smooth, and then if you just took a light sandpaper to them, it would perfect them. Just be careful of the fumes that it lets out. Try to wear a respirator whenever you use a soldering iron because you're melting plastic, even though it's safe. Make sure you wear a respirator. So now I'm going to go over a couple different methods. So this is the method that I use for my 3D prints. I always start with an 80 or a 100 grit for my sandpaper, and I try to knock down as much of those lines as possible. The more elbow grease that you put in on the 180 grit step, the easier it'll be to get those lines off. Then I'll move up to a 150, a 220, a 400, and then I'll make sure that I hit all the lines and eyes and details with the file. Afterwards, I start with a 600 wet sand, 800, 1000, and 1500 using soap and water and sanding the entire print, and this ends up giving it a glass smooth finish and it makes it ready for primer. A lot of people don't recommend doing this type of method because they think that it makes the walls too thin of the model. I just like to not use as much primer and Bondo as possible. The more that you have to use of that, the more money you have to spend. So try to knock down the lines before you even put the primer on, just to save you a little bit of money, and it'll make your life a lot easier. Next, I'm going to go over kind of like the traditional method. This seems to be the go-to fast and easy way for people to sand their 3D prints. I don't like to do this way specifically because it's a lot of rinse and repeat, sanding, priming, and while that is an okay and safe method, and it'll probably save you a little bit of extra room on your walls, this just takes too long and it uses up a lot of primer. You can go through 2 to 3 cans of primer and a whole tube of the Bondo glazing putty just to make your print smooth. So most people start off with the 150, sand the entire print, try to get out as much lines as possible, and then move up to a 220 buffing, and then using a file to sand down the sides and eyes of the print. And I've also seen some people use a 400 grit sandpaper before they hit the primer. Some people don't. Some people stop at the 220. So it's all up to your personal preference. In my opinion, the more that you sand the print and the more lines you get out before you even have to lay the primer on, just saves you a lot more money in primer and makes it a lot easier. So this is the traditional method. So this method I personally would never recommend. I've never tried it because it's very expensive, but this is supposed to be one of the safest ways to sand your print. It keeps all of the strength of the 3D print because the only thing that you're really going to be sanding is the primer and the filler. So this can be a very expensive way to make a 3D print smooth. I personally wouldn't recommend it, but it is a way that people do tend to sand their 3D models. So the first thing that they'll do straight off the bed of a 3D print, they will put a coat of primer on, maybe 1 or 2 coats, and without even sanding it, I've noticed that they put Bondo on. After they put the Bondo on is when they start to do their sanding, and while you are saving a lot of the strength and plastic on your 3D print, you're gonna have to rinse and repeat this multiple times using cans and tubes of the primer and filler just to make your print smooth. And especially if you're doing, you know, an entire suit or a lot of helmets, this is gonna rack up really quick and I wouldn't recommend it. So just be cautious of how much you're spending on that. Thank you guys for watching my video. I hope it helped you guys learn some different tools and methods to sand your 3D prints before you even have to put a primer on. I'm currently working on a lot of different projects right now, so if the videos are a little bit slower coming out, that's why. But thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more.